Now moving to item 12, development contributions, existing use credits in the central city.
When we're breaking? Are we breaking at all?
We'll go through till the end. I'm not anticipating this is going to take a huge amount of time, so we'll just continue till we get to the end.
Thanks, Andrew. And Council, you know myself and Gavin Thomas. So just to briefly explain the context of this paper, and then I'll talk to a suggested amendment to the 1D. The purpose of this paper is to respond to a request from councillors to bring back an option to effectively retain development contribution credits as they apply for the central city. The mechanism for doing so is proposed in the paper to remit where an application is used for a DC. So it would apply in situations where development is occurring. We wouldn't remit unless a development is occurring. The proposal in the paper addresses the issue that we will start to experience probably after February next year, which is 10 years from demolition. DC credits will start to expire, and that will apply across the city. The exact date that any DC credit expires, we will only know if an application is used for those credits, but it will be 10 years from the dates of demolition, which probably won't start before February next year. And I'd just remind councillors that this is a specific proposal as it relates to expiry of DC credits. We have a wider piece of work which is about the DC policy, and the DC policy is the permanent mechanism for picking up whether or not the current setting in the DC policy of a 10-year time limit is the setting that you want to maintain going forward. You can make a variety of choices there. We've had a lot of workshops on that. We've got another workshop on the 27th of October, and then we'll be bringing the DC policy to this committee for approval for public consultation that will run in parallel with the LTP. The reason for that is because the financial settings in the DC policy are contingent on the capital program, and so it's prudent to wait now for another 2 months until we've got the draft capital program and then get the calibrations right about what the appropriate DC settings are through a DC policy, which will then be approved either in parallel or immediately thereafter the LTP in the middle of next year. So we would suggest an addition which is highlighted up there, which I can't actually read, but I suspect says puts an end date to the remissions by the 30th of June 2021.
So we've got paragraph D. Remissions are only available until the council reviews and adopts the development contributions policy, or 30th of June 2021, whichever is earlier.
Yeah. Gavin, are you happy to answer any questions? Or?
All right. So just referring to the section of the report, Leanne, sorry. Yeah. The part of the report, paragraphs 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, that refers to why have this apply to the central city only. I'm finding it very difficult to see, even within those paragraphs, why we wouldn't say that there are some suburban areas, probably those which have been subject to council master planning, and there are some obvious ones, that this could apply to, and possibly should apply to, in the same way. So I'm thinking of New Brighton, Sydenham, Littleton, areas that were devastated by the earthquakes, where there's significant rebuilding to do, and where an existing credit would have some value in what are difficult development economic situations in some of those suburban areas as they are in the city. So why are you not recommending that we would do this in some of those suburban areas as well?
So we have addressed that option in the report. Just to reiterate, the likely period that this would apply is from 10 years from a demolition. So depending on which earthquake triggered resulting demolition, either the September 2010 or February 2011 earthquakes, the likely time period for the expiry of credits for the most part is from February 2021 onwards. If you take that as the date where the building was either demolished or demolition occurred at the very earliest. So the time period is relatively narrow that this would apply to. The other principal issue is the proposed remission applies to DC credits or existing use credits, and they're applicable where a high level of existing use credits exist, and for the most part that would apply for central city sites, and where a high level of credits are required for any future development. So in the absence of existing use credits, it defaults back to 1 Huey per title. So if you're building a residential property or a commercial property that only requires 1 Huey for its DCs, and existing use credits apply on that site, doesn't matter where it is, then when redeveloped, those credits basically disappear. They're not required for that site and they're not transferable to any other site. So the likely application of credits is where there's a level of intensification typically seen in the central city, and where there has historically been a level of intensification where the DCs were paid for, and as a result a credit exists, which again is in the central city. But it's a genuine option for council, and it's also something that I know that we've talked about informally in terms of the DC policy, is about the application of the DC policy in any remissions or other mechanisms such as rebates outside the central city.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm indicating through the question that I probably would be happy to see this applied more widely than the central city. There would be examples in suburban areas, I'm sure, of where there would be, you know, maybe there was a single-storey 50 square metre shop on a site that for sensible development economics reasons now needs to be developed as a 2 or 3 storey site, maybe with some residential upstairs. Sydenham, Littleton would be great examples of where that's a likely outcome. I think there would be some common sense in saying the development is, well, we could even say city-wide, actually. And then it means that should anybody put something forward between, say, February 21 and June 21, it's covered by this. I don't think we want to be restricting development in any part of the city, particularly those badly damaged, earthquake-ravaged areas. So maybe if I can indicate that I'd be happy to move this, but with that additional wording.
Yes, so we'd probably just change 1A then, that
Yep.
The development is district-wide.
Just delete 1A.
Yeah.
If we take A out, it means it's citywide.
citywide.
Yeah.
All right, let's do that. So I'm indicating I'll move this. Tim, you're indicating you'll second. That's great. Let's keep with questions for the moment. Leanne.
All done.
All right.
That was
And
it.
James,
So
you're good now as
you've
well?
captured it all, and that's fine.
All right, excellent. Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. Further to that, we've got a Stockburn service centre sitting there. Does this apply to council land and buildings?
It applies to all land and buildings. So,
Right. So we have an opportunity here, maybe.
well, the council, if it redeveloped that site, would get credits based on the demand that the building that is there placed on council infrastructure.
Right. So is that worth a conversation going forward, or is it not a possibility?
Credits aren't transferable, so as Gavin says, it's, what's there is there, and it will remain there 10 years from demolition. But the credits would apply to that site, so it depends on what the future, any future development of that site is that DC credits could apply to.
Okay.
But there are other examples around where the council and any other developer has existing use credits and has a firm plan for development, and then those credits come into play.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Phil.
So thanks. With now it's for the whole city, now, isn't it? So if you had something which was demolished before the earthquakes, what in the past, how long could you carry them on for?
10 years.
It was only 10 years anyway,
yeah.
so it just, okay.
10 years is the provision in the policy.
Right, so really it's just tidying up.
Well, it's tidying it up in as much as it's tiding over until you get to reconsider this issue through the policy review process.
So if I had a building that was demolished in, say, Stockburn 15 years ago, I couldn't carry that
No.
forward. Never could have.
No. What you would have is one household unit equivalent, which is the minimum that any previously developed property would have.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yanni?
Yeah, I was trying to understand in terms of the financial impact. So do we have any sense of the financial impact? Like,
Not really, particularly for the central city option, because we just simply don't know when and what development will happen. So it's just based on between now and the 30th of June or earlier, what development happens on what site and to what degree would they normally have had to pay DCs. So the reality is this will affect very few developments, but for those that it does affect, it gives them some certainty until the council can make its decision about a longer term solution, if that's where you want to go.
and I was just interested whether people with these sites can actually apply for an existing use rights, or whether if there's any other mechanism by which they can extend their eligibility on a case-by-case basis rather than us passing this as a policy.
No, what this is asking you to do is to use the remission provision within the policy for this purpose. So it's very much using, in an innovative way if you like, a provision we already have to fill this gap until we get to the reviewed policy. But property owners normally will only know what credits they have on their property when they come to the council and say, I want to redevelop this land, this is what I want to do, at which point we'll say, well, we need to look at what you have in previous use credits, and they'll do an assessment of that site. So unless it's a residential site where it's just one household unit equivalent, but if it's a non-residential previous use, it needs to be assessed by our DC assessors to ascertain that demand.
Right. And I'm just wondering, the other question is, I'm wondering why we've done previous things of this in public excluded, and we're doing this one in public.
There's nothing commercially sensitive or a reason for this to be in PX.
Right.
Any PX in the past would have been done for a specific development and would have gone into some detail about it. This has no specificity about it.
Do we need to do anything to make this consistent with previous decisions made for specific cases, e.g. rule them out of eligibility in this because they've got a separate agreement?
No, this provision here will sit quite separate from anything that's happened in the past.
Yeah, I guess what I was concerned about is if we make it city-wide,
Yeah.
we'll have possibly people coming, and we don't know the quantum of that. But one or two significant developers could actually put a huge call on this fund.
They could, but I would think that would be highly unlikely because firstly they would have had to have had their building demolished immediately after the September quake or the February quake. And, you know, there are instances of that, we know, and we're just taking a belts and braces approach with this. But it would be very unlikely for developers to be able to take advantage of this in a way that they wouldn't have been able to anyway.
Yeah, I guess the final question from me was I was just wondering in terms of the DC assessment, because it's such a short time between, February and June, so whether or not there was any mechanism by which when we do the assessment, the payment of them is delayed until we've resolved the policy. So I guess what I'm worried about is if we adopt this today, it's a bit like the other DC's one. It sets a precedent,
Yeah.
and then when we come to review it, we actually are stuck with an expectation that it will exist. So I'm just trying to understand if there's any other mechanism that would enable, just for those few months, the existing credits to apply without adopting this framework.
We looked at how we could do that and how, because initially we thought we'd be able to do this by way of a practice note. And we looked at that and found that we didn't have the delegation to operate outside the provisions of the policy. So that's why we're using this approach, which does use a provision in the policy, rather than trying to invent a new policy provision, given that you're currently in the process of reviewing that policy.
And noting that this is time limited to the 30th of June, assuming this passes the way that it's on the table, and by the time this comes to an end, we will have a new policy position, which we will have worked out. There's certainly nothing about this that suggests that the new policy position would necessarily continue it or would necessarily not continue it. That'll be a matter for the policy debate. All right, are there any further questions? All right, so this has been moved and seconded. Is there any debate? James?
Shouldn't go early if I've learned anything here, but I don't think this is too controversial. Look, this isn't a handout or a mission, and I think that's something that people need to bear in mind. It just recognises that a DC has already been paid for the site, and I think what's really critical is that you have to frame this in light of the post-earthquake or post-disaster environment that we find ourselves in, which is somewhat unique, to say the least. So the removal of the original 1A, I think, is entirely appropriate because the earthquake didn't discriminate against areas or central cities versus suburban areas. It affected all of Christchurch, so applying it citywide I think is appropriate. And the last point that I want to make on this is fundamentally this just keeps us in a short-term holding pattern until the wider policy is adopted, and although there is a time frame associated with it, we're never going to get to that 2021 date because the policy is likely to be adopted in front of us within a matter of months. So I think it makes complete sense, and I hope you all support it.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really pleased that it's going citywide. I think we've got some of the smaller key activity areas that really need stimulus. And if we're talking about morale in the city, etc., to go through your local shops and there are gaps and they're still kind of looking pretty shabby, and then you have one new building surrounded by kind of vacant sites which look really shocking. I think this hopefully will give stimulus to those in those community and those smaller key activity areas to get going. So I think it's a really good change, a really good addition, and I hope you support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly realising that there was an exceptional level of demolition, most of which was completely unexpected and wouldn't have happened as a result of the earthquakes, and realising that all across the city there are a number of vacant sites that remain vacant and haven't been redeveloped, perhaps as quickly as we might have expected. Realising that demand and development economics have played a big role in the reasons that those sites haven't been developed, and that's relative to the city centre and to a number of suburban areas which are very obvious as we move around the city. But also realising that we will be reviewing the policy, as has been noted, within the short term. This is a stopgap. It is one that almost certainly won't affect very many properties. But for the properties that it does affect, it will make a difference. It could well be the difference between building a building on the site being economically viable or not, and that in fact may result in either a building being built where a building where a building otherwise perhaps wouldn't have been built. The application of this citywide is something I think is absolutely the right thing to do. As you move around the city and you look at areas like Stanmore Road or Beckenham or New Brighton or Sydenham or Littleton, you see suburban areas that were previously vibrant, where there are still vacant sites, and in many cases vacant sites where there may not be a lot of prospect of significant development in the near future. But anything we can do to assist with that is important, and this is one way that we can assist with that. So I support this, and I certainly support it being applied citywide. The policy is currently the city centre. So this actually extends the policy to a citywide position, which is something I'm hoping that there'll be support for as we pass this today. Thank you. Yanni.
I can't support this today. I think we need to be really careful. What we're doing is effectively saying to people, you can sit on your land longer and you will still get the credits in the future. So I think to say that somehow this is going to be enabling of development is not quite the right way to phrase it. I mean, I get why people are saying between when they expire and when they the policy gets reviewed that there is an opportunity in there that might make things a bit more economically viable. But fundamentally, extending the time frame gives people a longer time frame where which they can actually sit on land that hasn't been developed. And so that does concern me. But actually, in my view, just we're giving away a blank check, and I don't like that. I'd much rather see on a case-by-case basis, if people have got a proposal and they don't qualify because they've been out of the time, then I'd rather that come back to us with the financial quantum that will be impacting on our budgets. And I know that this is rates funded borrowing, but this is actually money that we've already put aside, and I appreciate that. But I still think, given the impact that one or two big developments could have on this funding, that it would be much better for us at a governance level to see the proposal, understand the financial impact, and then make a decision. So I'm not happy with just putting in a blank check across the city. There's councillors who weren't on this council, and there's councillors who were on this council when we've previously discussed a similar issue, and the quantum of that is very, very significant. So I just can't support the approach that we're being asked to take today. I think there's a better way to do it, which is the way we did it in the past, and I'd much prefer that approach. But I think the other key thing is to get that policy in place as soon as possible.
Leanne.
I'll just follow up on that and just remind people that previous use credits attach to the site. So the development contributions have already been paid. They expire 10 years after the demolition of a previous development on the site. So 10 years, okay, most of the buildings in the central city were covered by the February earthquake or led to their demolition. They weren't demolished at the time of the earthquakes necessarily. Many of them were demolished after the earthquakes. And the claiming of the development credits, contributions that were already paid, it's a short window, and it's up until the end of June next year, when the development contributions policy is adopted. I actually think that this puts pressure on us to adopt their development contributions policy, and I think we should. I think we should have that pressure put on us to do that. It's an important policy, and it's an important mechanism for recognising the actual cost of the infrastructure that relates to the particular development. And I'm afraid in the central city, when we're looking at the extent of the work that's already been done on the infrastructure and the incredible amenity that sits within the central city as well, I think that it is something that we do need to review. So just allowing for this window of time for a small one, I don't think has the concerns that Yanni has expressed. It's a relatively short period of time, but just gives some people some certainty that will be the case until the development contributions policy is in place or the end of the financial year.
Thank you. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? So just Yanni against. That's carried. Thank you. Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of the agenda. So I'll now close